What happens when a Hollywood star known for staying calm suddenly finds himself pushed into a tense debate on live daytime television? And the conversation takes a turn nobody in the studio expected. Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The cameras are already rolling, the studio audience is buzzing, and the panel is midway through a discussion when Jake Gyllenhaal walks out onto the stage. The applause is loud, the kind that fills the room for several seconds. Jake smiles, waving to the audience as he takes a seat beside the hosts. Whoopi Goldberg leans back slightly in her chair, smiling at him. Jake, welcome. It's good to have you here. Jake nods politely. Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this. Joy Behar jumps in with a grin. You say that now. Wait 5 minutes. The audience laughs. Jake chuckles. That sounds a little ominous. Whoopi lifts her mug and takes a sip before setting it down again. Well, we like real conversations here. That's the whole point. Jake nods. That's good. Real conversations are important. Sunny Hostin glances toward him. So you're here promoting the new film, but there's also been a lot of discussion about something you said recently in an interview. You talked about how Hollywood conversations around politics can sometimes feel performative. Jake exhales softly, already sensing where this might go. Yeah, I said that, he replies calmly. And I think what I meant was that sometimes discussions in Hollywood can turn into statements instead of actual conversations. A few audience members murmur. Whoopi raises an eyebrow slightly. Statements instead of conversations? She repeats. Jake nods. Yeah, I think sometimes people feel pressured to say the right thing, rather than actually talk about complicated issues honestly. Joy tilts her head. But isn't that just accountability? She asks. Jake shrugs lightly. It can be, but sometimes it also shuts down dialogue. The audience reacts with a mixture of applause and murmurs. Whoopi leans forward slightly now, clearly interested. Well, hold on, she says. Because when people say things like that, what some folks hear is, people shouldn't speak up. Jake shakes his head immediately. No, that's not what I'm saying. But that's how it can sound, Whoopi replies calmly. Jake nods again, acknowledging her point. I understand that. But I think there's a difference between speaking up and creating an environment where people feel afraid to say anything that isn't perfectly aligned. Sunny jumps in. But Jake, a lot of people would say that accountability isn't fear. It's responsibility. Jake pauses for a second, choosing his words carefully. I agree with responsibility. I really do. I just think sometimes conversations stop being conversations when everyone already knows what answer is expected. A few people in the audience clap quietly. Whoopi glances toward them, then back to Jake. So you're saying people feel pressured to agree with a certain viewpoint? Jake nods slowly. In some spaces, yeah. Joy laughs lightly. You realize you're saying this on this show, right? The audience laughs again. Jake smiles. I know. That's why I said I like real conversations. Whoopi folds her hands on the table. Well, we definitely have those here. She looks directly at him. But here's the thing, Jake. When celebrities talk about pressure to say the right thing, some people hear that as complaining about being asked to care. The audience reacts with a few claps. Jake leans slightly forward now. I'm not complaining about caring. I care deeply about a lot of issues. Then what's the problem? Whoopi asks. Jake takes a breath. The problem is when conversations become about proving you're on the right side instead of actually understanding each other. Sunny raises an eyebrow. But isn't understanding each other exactly what these conversations are meant to do? Jake nods. In theory, yes. Joy jumps in again. But you're suggesting that doesn't happen. Jake shrugs. Sometimes it doesn't. The audience shifts slightly. The tone in the room has changed from playful to more serious. Whoopi notices it too. So give us an example, she says. Jake hesitates for a second. Well, sometimes someone asks a question or raises a concern, and instead of engaging with the idea, people jump straight to labeling that person. Sunny responds quickly. Because sometimes those questions come from harmful perspectives. Jake nods again. That's true sometimes, but not always. A brief pause settles over the table. Joy glances between them. You know, this is the part where the internet starts writing headlines. The audience laughs again, easing the tension for a moment. Jake smiles slightly. Yeah, probably. Whoopi looks at him closely. But you knew this would come up, right? When you said what you said in that interview. Jake nods. I did. And you still stand by it? Jake answers without hesitation. Yes. The audience reacts again, a mix of applause and murmurs. Whoopi taps her fingers lightly on the table. Okay, let's unpack that. She turns slightly toward the audience. Because people watching at home might hear this and think Hollywood actors are saying they feel silenced. And I want to be clear about what we're actually talking about. Jake nods respectfully. Fair. Sonny leans toward him. Do you feel silenced? Jake shakes his head. No, I'm sitting here on national television. The audience laughs. But I do think there's a difference between having a platform and feeling like you can speak honestly without backlash. Whoopi tilts her head. But backlash is also part of free speech. Jake nods again. Absolutely. People have every right to disagree. Then what's the issue? Whoopi asks again. Jake pauses. The issue is when disagreement turns into immediate dismissal. The audience goes quiet for a moment. Joy folds her arms. Some people would say dismissal happens because certain ideas are harmful. Jake looks at her. And sometimes people assume harm before listening. A few people in the audience clap again. Sonny looks slightly skeptical. But Jake, a lot of marginalized communities don't have the luxury of endless debate about their rights. Jake nods firmly. I agree with that. Then where's the line? Sonny asks. Jake takes a breath. That's the conversation we should be having. Whoopi watches him carefully now. And you think we're not? Jake shrugs slightly. I think sometimes we skip straight to conclusions. The audience murmurs again. Whoopi leans back in her chair. Well, that's an interesting perspective. Joy looks toward Whoopi. You're being very calm about this. Whoopi smiles slightly. Oh, I'm calm now. The audience laughs nervously. She looks back at Jake. But here's what I'm curious about. When someone with a huge platform like yours says people feel pressured, do you understand why some folks might hear that as minimizing the importance of speaking out? Jake nods slowly. Yes, and that's not my intention. Intentions matter, Whoopi replies. But impact matters too. Jake leans forward again. I agree with that. Sonny watches the exchange closely. So if the impact of your words makes some people feel like accountability is being dismissed, what do you say to them? Jake pauses for a long moment. The audience is completely quiet now. Well, he finally says, I'd say they deserve to be heard too. Whoopi raises an eyebrow. They already are. Jake gently shakes his head. Not always. That line lands heavily in the room. A ripple of reactions moves through the audience. Joy looks at him, surprised. Sonny turns slightly toward Whoopi, and Whoopi Goldberg slowly leans forward, resting her arms on the table as she looks directly at Jake. Well, she says carefully, her voice lower now. That's where we might start disagreeing. The audience reacts immediately. Some clap, some gasp, and suddenly the friendly promotional interview has turned into something much more serious. Jake notices the shift too. He nods once calmly. Okay, he says. Let's talk about it. Whoopi keeps her arms resting on the table, watching Jake closely for a moment before speaking again. The studio audience is noticeably quieter now, the earlier laughter replaced with that familiar tension that sometimes fills the room when the conversation moves into deeper territory. Well, Whoopi says, her tone calm but firm. Since you said let's talk about it, let's talk about it. A few audience members clap lightly. Jake nods, still composed. Sure. Sonny shifts in her seat slightly, turning toward him. Because when you say some voices aren't being heard, a lot of people would say historically it's the opposite problem. Certain voices have dominated for decades. The audience applauds that point. Jake nods immediately. That's true. Historically, absolutely. Joy looks at him. But you're saying that now the pendulum has swung too far? Jake shakes his head quickly. No, I'm not saying that either. Whoopi raises an eyebrow. Then clarify. Jake leans forward slightly, resting his hands together on the table. What I'm saying is that progress should include conversation, not just agreement. Joy chuckles lightly. Well, agreement would make our jobs a lot easier. The audience laughs briefly, but the tension returns almost immediately. Sonny looks at Jake again. But conversations about rights and equality aren't always comfortable debates. Sometimes there's a clear right and wrong. Jake nods. Sometimes, yes. But you sound like you're suggesting everything is open for debate, Sonny replies. Jake shakes his head again. No, I'm suggesting people should be able to ask questions without immediately being labeled. The audience murmurs. Whoopi leans forward slightly again. Let me ask you something directly, she says. Jake nods. Okay, Do you think people are being labeled unfairly right now? Jake pauses for a moment. I think sometimes people assume bad intentions before hearing someone out. A few audience members clap again. Sunny crosses her arms lightly. But intention isn't the only thing that matters, she says. Jake nods. I agree with that. Joy glances toward Whoopi. You know what this reminds me of, she says. What? Whoopi asks. The classic celebrity line. We just need more conversation. The audience laughs. Joy continues, smiling but still serious. And people at home go, yeah, but conversation about what exactly? Jake smiles faintly. Fair question. Whoopi looks directly at him. So answer it. Jake takes a breath. Conversation about how we move forward without assuming the worst about each other. Sunny tilts her head. But sometimes the worst is already happening to people. Jake nods again. Yes, and those realities should absolutely be addressed. Then what's the hesitation? Sunny asks. Jake thinks for a moment. The hesitation is when discussions become so polarized that people stop listening. The audience reacts again with mixed applause and murmurs. Joy looks toward the crowd and gestures. See, this is the internet right here. Half clapping, half side-eye. The audience laughs again. Whoopi smiles briefly but then turns serious again. Jake, here's where I think people struggle with what you're saying. Jake listens closely. When someone with influence says people feel afraid to speak honestly, the question becomes, afraid of what? Jake answers calmly. Afraid of being misunderstood. Sunny responds quickly. Or afraid of being criticized? Jake shrugs lightly. Criticism is fine. I'm talking about immediate condemnation. Joy leans in. Welcome to television. The audience laughs again. Jake chuckles softly. Fair enough. Whoopi watches him carefully. But let's be honest, she says. You're not exactly someone without a voice. Jake nods. I know that. You're an Oscar-nominated actor, Joy adds. Exactly, Whoopi continues. People hear you. Jake responds quietly but clearly. And I'm grateful for that. Sunny glances toward the audience. But the concern some people have is that when celebrities frame themselves as being restricted, it can sound out of touch with what ordinary people experience. The audience claps. Jake nods again. I understand that perspective. Do you? Sunny asks. Jake looks at her directly. Yes. A small pause follows. Then Jake adds something that shifts the tone again. But I also think dismissing someone's perspective because they're successful isn't fair either. The audience reacts immediately with louder murmurs. Joy leans back slightly. Oh! Whoopi raises her eyebrows. That's an interesting point. Sunny looks slightly surprised. So you think people dismiss celebrities unfairly? Jake answers carefully. I think sometimes people assume that because someone is successful, their perspective automatically lacks value. Joy jumps in. Well, sometimes it does. The audience laughs loudly. Jake laughs too, shaking his head. Sometimes sure. Whoopi smiles briefly, but then returns to the discussion. But you have to understand why people might be skeptical. Jake nods. Of course. Sunny gestures with her hands. Because for a long time, celebrities were treated like moral authorities on everything. Jake agrees. That's true. And now when there's pushback, Sunny continues, some celebrities seem surprised by it. Jake considers that. That's fair criticism. Joy raises her eyebrows. You're being very diplomatic. Jake smiles slightly. I'm trying to have a conversation. Whoopi laughs quietly. Well, you picked the right place. The audience applauds. But then Whoopi leans forward again, her tone sharpening slightly. But let me push back on something you said earlier. Jake nods. You said people assume harm before listening. Jake nods again. Sometimes. Whoopi tilts her head. But what if people have already heard those arguments before? The audience murmurs in agreement. Jake pauses. That's possible. Sunny jumps in. For example, when discussions happen about equality or social justice, communities affected by those issues have often been having those conversations for decades. Jake nods slowly. I respect that. Then what exactly is missing from the conversation? Sunny asks. Jake takes a moment before answering. Empathy across perspectives. Joy sighs slightly. That word again. The audience chuckles. Jake looks at her. You don't like that word? Joy smiles. No, I like it. I just think people use it differently. Whoopi nods. Exactly. She looks at Jake. Because for some people, empathy means listening to people who've already been ignored for years. Jake nods. And that's important. But when someone says we should empathize with people who are questioning those issues, Whoopi continues. She pauses. You see how that can sound? Jake responds carefully. I do. Sunny leans forward slightly. So do you think there are viewpoints in these conversations that deserve less space? Jake pauses again. That question clearly requires careful wording. I think harmful ideas should absolutely be challenged, he says. But not ignored? Sunny presses. Jake shakes his head. I think understanding why people think certain things can help address the problem. The audience reacts again with a mixture of agreement and skepticism. Joy turns to Whoopi. This is turning into a philosophy class. Whoopi smiles slightly. No, this is just a Tuesday. The audience laughs. But then Whoopi turns back to Jake, her tone becoming more serious. You seem like someone who genuinely wants dialogue, she says. Jake nods. I do. But here's where I struggle, Whoopi continues. She leans forward slightly, her voice steady. For many communities, these debates aren't abstract. They're about real lives. The audience applauds strongly. Jake nods respectfully. I understand that. And when those communities hear someone say, we need more conversation, sometimes they hear, your pain is still up for discussion. The room goes quiet. Jake takes a moment before responding. I would never want anyone to feel that way. Sunny watches him carefully. But do you see why they might? Jake nods. Yes. Whoopi studies him for a moment. Then she asks a question that immediately raises the stakes of the conversation. So let me ask you something directly, Jake. Jake nods. Go ahead. Whoopi rests her hands on the table. Do you think shows like this, discussions like this, contribute to the problem you're describing? The audience gasps slightly. Joy turns toward Jake. Sunny watches closely. And suddenly the conversation has turned directly toward the show itself. Jake pauses, realizing exactly how delicate this moment is. He glances briefly at the audience, then back at the table. And after a few seconds, he answers. Sometimes, yes. The audience erupts with reactions. Some applause. Some shocked murmurs. Joy leans back in her chair, eyes wide. Well, that's one way to keep the segment interesting. Sunny looks toward Whoopi. And Whoopi Goldberg slowly nods, staring at Jake for a long moment before responding. Oh, she pauses. So now we're talking about us. The audience is still reacting when the moment settles again. Some people are clapping, others are murmuring, and a few are clearly surprised by what Jake just said. The energy in the room has shifted again, and everyone at the table feels it. Joy Behar leans back slightly, shaking her head with a half smile. Well, you came ready today. A few people in the audience laugh. Jake exhales lightly and lifts his hands just a little. I promise I'm not here to attack the show. Whoopi Goldberg doesn't immediately respond. She sits back in her chair, looking at him steadily for a moment before speaking. But you did say sometimes shows like this contribute to the problem, she says. Her tone isn't angry, but it's serious. Jake nods. Sometimes. Sunny Hostin tilts her head, watching him carefully. So explain that, she says. The audience quiets down again. Jake looks around the table before answering. Well, shows like this are designed for quick conversations about complicated issues. And sometimes complicated issues need more time than television allows. Joy raises an eyebrow. So we're rushing the revolution? The audience laughs again. Jake smiles slightly. No, I'm just saying TV formats can simplify things. Whoopi nods slowly. That's true for every show on television. Jake agrees. Exactly. But that doesn't mean the conversation shouldn't happen, Sunny adds quickly. Jake shakes his head. I'm not saying it shouldn't. Then what are you saying? Sunny asks. Jake leans forward slightly again. I'm saying when conversations happen in short segments, people sometimes speak in headlines instead of nuance. The audience murmurs. Joy points toward him. Okay, that I actually agree with. More laughter. But Whoopi is still focused. So you think we create headlines instead of discussions? Jake responds carefully. Sometimes the structure pushes it that way. Sunny crosses her arms lightly. But Jake, people also tune in because they want clarity. They want to hear people stand up for things. Jake nods. That's fair. But when someone says, let's hear every perspective, Sunny continues, that can sometimes include perspectives that hurt people. Jake pauses again. I understand that concern. Whoopi finally leans forward again, resting her forearms on the table. Here's the tricky part, she says. Jake listens. Shows like this exist because people want to hear different opinions. That's literally the point of the table. The audience applauds. Jake nods respectfully. I respect that. But when you say we contribute to the problem, Whoopi continues, you're suggesting something more than just time limits. The audience murmurs again. Jake thinks for a moment. I think sometimes the way debates happen on TV can encourage people to pick sides instead of understand each other. Joy laughs. That's not just TV. That's humans. The audience laughs loudly. Jake laughs too. Okay, that's fair. Sunny leans forward slightly. But isn't picking a side sometimes necessary? Jake nods. Yes, especially when it comes to justice, Sunny adds. Jake agrees again. Absolutely. Whoopi studies him for a moment. You keep agreeing, she says. Jake smiles slightly. Because a lot of what you're saying is true. The audience chuckles. Joy looks at him. So where exactly do you disagree with us? Jake pauses. Well, I think sometimes disagreement gets interpreted as hostility. Sunny responds quickly. Sometimes it is hostility. Jake nods. Sometimes it is. Whoopi tilts her head slightly. But you think sometimes it isn't. Jake answers calmly. Yes. The audience is listening closely now. Even the laughter has mostly disappeared. Joy folds her arms. You realize people watching at home right now are already picking teams. The audience laughs again. Jake smiles faintly. That's kind of my point. Sunny glances toward the audience. But disagreement on television can also educate people. Jake nods. It can. Then why frame it as a problem? Sunny asks. Jake takes a breath. I'm not framing disagreement as the problem. Then what is? Sunny presses. Jake answers carefully. The assumption that disagreement always means bad intentions. The audience murmurs again. Whoopi leans back slightly. You know why people assume bad intentions sometimes? Jake nods slowly. Because history gives them reasons. The audience applauds loudly. Jake nods respectfully. That's true. Sunny gestures toward Whoopi. That's what we're saying. Jake responds calmly. And I agree with that context. Joy raises her eyebrows. You're agreeing again. Jake laughs quietly. I told you I'm not here to fight. Whoopi smiles briefly, but her expression turns serious again. But there is a disagreement here, she says. Jake nods. Yes. Whoopi points gently toward him. You believe people should give each other more benefit of the doubt. Jake nods. Yes. Then Whoopi gestures outward toward the audience. But many people feel they've already given too much of that. The audience applauds strongly. Jake pauses before responding. That's understandable. Sunny watches him carefully. But understanding that doesn't seem to change your position. Jake answers honestly. No. The audience reacts again. Joy leans forward. So you're sticking with the idea that society needs more open conversation. Jake nods. Yes. Sunny looks thoughtful. But what if those conversations slow down progress? The audience murmurs again. Jake responds calmly. I think shutting conversations down can also slow progress. That line gets another mix of applause and skeptical reactions. Whoopi watches him carefully again. You know what's interesting? She says. Jake looks at her. What? You're talking about dialogue, but dialogue requires trust. Jake nods. Exactly. And trust is something a lot of people feel has been broken for a long time, Whoopi says. The audience claps again. Jake nods respectfully. That's valid. Sunny jumps in. And rebuilding that trust doesn't happen just by saying, let's talk. Jake agrees. That's true. Joy looks between them. So what's the first step then? Jake thinks for a moment. Listening without assuming the worst. Sunny raises an eyebrow. But what if the worst is exactly what someone is saying? The audience reacts again. Jake nods. Then it should be challenged. Sunny presses further. Strongly. Jake nods. Yes. But respectfully? Sunny asks. Jake pauses. If possible. Joy laughs loudly. Oh boy. The audience laughs with her. Whoopi smiles slightly, but then looks back at Jake. You know, I think what people might hear in what you're saying is frustration. Jake nods. Maybe. Frustration with what exactly? Whoopi asks. Jake pauses again. Then he answers honestly. With how quickly people assume they know what someone else believes. The audience murmurs. Sunny tilts her head. But don't you think sometimes people show exactly what they believe? Jake nods. Yes. But sometimes they don't. Joy looks toward the audience again. This is like watching a tennis match. The audience laughs. But Whoopi suddenly asks something that shifts the tone again. Let me ask you something personal, she says. Jake nods. Okay. Have you ever held back from saying something publicly because you were worried about how people would react? The audience quiets instantly. Jake takes a moment. Then he answers honestly. Yes. The audience murmurs. Sunny leans forward slightly. About what? Jake hesitates. Well, opinions about certain cultural conversations. Joy looks curious. Like what? Jake smiles slightly, but he doesn't answer directly. That's kind of the point. The audience reacts again. Whoopi nods slowly. So you're saying there are things you feel you can't say. Jake clarifies quickly. Not can't. Just things that require more context than headlines allow. Sunny studies him. But do you see how people might interpret that as you wanting to say something controversial? Jake nods. I do. Joy laughs. And now everyone wants to know what it is. The audience laughs loudly. Jake laughs too. See, that's the headline problem. Whoopi smiles briefly, but her tone remains thoughtful. Well, you certainly got people talking. Jake nods. That's the goal. Sunny looks at him again. But conversations also come with consequences. Jake agrees. They should. Whoopi leans back in her chair. Well, this has definitely turned into one of the more interesting interviews we've had in a while. The audience laughs and applauds. Joy nods. That's for sure. But the tension hasn't fully disappeared. Whoopi glances toward the audience, then back at Jake. You know, people are going to be debating this conversation all day. Jake smiles slightly. I figured. Sunny folds her hands together. And honestly, we're not even done yet. The audience cheers. Whoopi nods once. Because when we come back, she pauses for a second. I want to talk about the reaction this kind of conversation gets online. The audience reacts loudly. Joy laughs. Oh yeah, that part gets messy. Jake chuckles quietly. I'm aware. Whoopi looks directly at the camera for a moment before turning back toward the table. And trust me, when people hear what you said today. She pauses again. The internet is definitely going to have something to say about it. The audience is still buzzing as the conversation continues. The energy in the room hasn't fully settled since Jake admitted he's held back from sharing certain opinions publicly. The tension isn't explosive, but it's thick. The kind that happens when everyone realizes the discussion has moved far beyond a simple promotional interview. Whoopi Goldberg glances toward the audience and then back at Jake. So let's talk about the part that happens after conversations like this, she says. Jake nods slightly. The internet, Joy Behar adds with a dramatic sigh. The audience laughs. Sunny Hostin leans forward slightly. Because whether we like it or not, what happens online now becomes part of the conversation. Jake nods. That's true. Whoopi gestures slightly with her hand. You already know this clip is going to be everywhere today. Jake smiles faintly. I figured. Joy jumps in. Oh, it's already being cut into 10-second clips as we speak. The audience laughs loudly. Sunny looks toward Jake again. And that's actually part of what you were talking about earlier. Headlines and quick reactions. Jake nods. Exactly. But that's the reality of modern media, Sunny adds. Jake shrugs slightly. It is. Whoopi rests her hands on the table again. And here's the interesting part, she says. When people watch clips later, they won't see the whole conversation. The audience murmurs. They'll see the moment you said this show contributes to the problem, Joy adds. The audience reacts again with a mixture of laughs and gasps. Jake raises his hand slightly. Which wasn't exactly what I meant. Joy grins. Too late. The audience laughs again. Sunny nods thoughtfully. This is actually an important point, though. Context disappears online. Jake agrees. All the time. Whoopi looks toward the audience. And then people start arguing about a 10-second clip like they saw the entire discussion. Several audience members clap in agreement. Jake leans back slightly in his chair now, which is part of why these conversations get so intense. Sunny nods. Because people react to pieces instead of the whole picture. Joy tilts her head toward Jake. So are you going to go home today and avoid social media? The audience laughs. Jake smiles. That's usually a good strategy. Whoopi chuckles softly. Smart man. Sunny glances at the audience again. But realistically, there will be strong reactions. Jake nods. Of course. Joy counts on her fingers dramatically. Half the internet will say you're brave for speaking up. The audience chuckles. And the other half will say you're completely wrong. More laughter. Jake nods. That sounds about right. Whoopi leans back in her chair. But here's something I'll say, she adds. Jake looks toward her. I appreciate that you stayed in the conversation. The audience applauds lightly. Jake nods respectfully. I think that's important. Sunny agrees. A lot of people would have tried to dodge those questions. Jake smiles slightly. Well, I did dodge one. Joy points at him. That mysterious opinion you refused to share. The audience laughs again. Jake laughs too. See. Headlines. Whoopi smiles. Fair enough. A brief pause settles over the table. The energy has softened slightly now that the most intense part of the debate is over. Sunny looks thoughtful. Moments like this are actually why people watch shows like this. Jake nods. For real conversations. Sunny agrees. Exactly. Joy gestures toward the audience. And apparently people enjoy watching a little tension too. The audience laughs loudly. Jake smiles. Apparently. Whoopi glances toward the camera for a moment, then back to the table. But there's another layer to this conversation. Jake listens. What happens after people leave the studio? The audience murmurs again. Sunny nods. Because discussions like this continue long after the cameras stop. Jake agrees. That's true. Joy grins. Producers are probably already checking Twitter. The audience laughs again. Whoopi chuckles. Oh, I guarantee they are. Sunny looks toward Jake. And honestly, people online will probably debate this for days. Jake nods calmly. I hope they actually watch the full conversation before reacting. The audience claps. Joy laughs. Jake, you're asking a lot from the internet. More laughter. Jake shrugs playfully. One can hope. Whoopi leans forward again slightly. But let me ask you something before we wrap this up. Jake nods. Do you regret saying anything you said today? The audience quiets instantly. Jake pauses for a moment before answering. No. The audience reacts immediately, a mix of applause and murmurs. Sunny nods thoughtfully. Even knowing the reaction that's coming? Jake answers calmly. I think conversations like this are worth having. The audience claps again. Joy looks impressed. Well, at least you're consistent. Jake laughs. I try. Whoopi studies him for a moment. Debates like this can get heated, she says. Jake nods. But the important part is that people keep talking. Jake agrees. That's exactly my point. Sunny smiles slightly. Look at that. We found some common ground. The audience applauds. Joy claps lightly as well. Finally, Jake laughs. Whoopi smiles. Well, I still disagree with you on some things. The audience laughs again. Jake nods respectfully. And that's okay. Whoopi raises her mug slightly. That's what conversation looks like. The audience applauds again, louder this time. Joy glances toward the crowd. Honestly, this audience handled that pretty well. A few audience members cheer. Sunny nods. They were very engaged. Jake smiles toward the crowd. I appreciate that. Whoopi turns slightly toward the camera now, shifting the moment toward a closing tone. Discussions like this are happening all over the country right now, she says. The audience listens closely. And whether people agree or disagree, the important thing is that we keep listening to each other. Jake nods. Sunny agrees. That's the goal. Joy gestures toward Jake again. And hopefully our guest survives the internet tonight. The audience bursts into laughter. Jake laughs too. I'll try. Whoopi smiles. Well, Jake, thank you for coming on and being willing to have the conversation. Jake nods. Thank you for having me. The audience applauds loudly. As the applause continues, the energy in the room finally shifts from tension to appreciation for the discussion that just happened. But the story clearly doesn't end in the studio. Because later that afternoon, clips from the conversation begin spreading across social media. One clip shows Jake saying that talk shows can sometimes contribute to polarized debates. Another shows Whoopi challenging him directly. Another shows the moment the audience gasped when he admitted he's held back opinions publicly. Within hours, thousands of comments start appearing online. Some viewers praise Jake for staying calm during a tough discussion. Others side strongly with Whoopi and the hosts, saying the pushback was necessary. Some debate the entire idea of open dialogue in today's culture. And others simply argue about who won the exchange. By the evening, entertainment blogs and talk show recap channels are already discussing the segment. Clips continue circulating. People keep debating. And the conversation that started at the table on live television keeps spreading across the internet. Which brings us to you. What do you think about this debate? Was Jake making a fair point about open conversations? Or do you think the hosts were right to challenge him? Share your opinion in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories and behind-the-scenes moments from the biggest conversations on television.